All right. Hello to all of you. I'm actually really glad to see that there are quite a few of you that have come, and the interest and the desire that you have for us here with Safe Church and forming that church, Safe Church in your classes. First off, just a little bit of intro for you guys. I am Heidi Venruco. I'm here in Sioux Center, Iowa. I have worked in Sioux Center Health for 20 years, and 12 of those years have been an RN. My husband works for the city of Sioux Center, and we have a son who is 9 and a daughter who is 7. Currently, we are members at Bethel CRC here in Sioux Center. That is where I helped implement and start Safe Church policy back in 2012. So we are on our 9th year here currently. We have experienced many personal and congregational feelings with the start of that Safe Church team, of course, and been through situations that have helped in the continual learning process and living policy that it is the front of every church member's minds. In the spring of 2019, our Classis Heartland and Iakota officially formed the Bi-Classical Safe Church team, which I am part of as the lay member. We as Classis Safe Church team really want what's best for your churches in all classes. And first, of course, to have that Safe Church team. Second, a policy to follow. And third, an actively working committee that is willing to go the distance for keeping your churches safe. So just a little bit of info other than the intro there. Certainly, if you do want to ask questions, I would love that. You can stop me any point and go ahead and ask auto-wise, or you can go ahead and type it in the chat box. I will try to get those answered. But just a little warning that this is my first Zoom presentation that I'm doing. So give me a little grace as I go through this, please. So I know it sounds so drag, but hang on here. I suppose I should try get this slideshow. There we go. I know it sounds kind of drag and kind of boring to be talking about policies today, but honestly, it is one of the best prevention tools that we have for a strong, safe church in our churches. Every church needs to have one. Children deserve it, and increasingly parents are starting to expect it, especially when you think of those who are transitioning into new churches, moving from one to another, parents who are highly interested in how their kids are safe and relying on other adults to watch them. Having a safe church in your church sends that strong message that it is that in this place, church follows Jesus' example and showing the concern for the least of these by protecting the most vulnerable among us, our children. All right, team expectations. Of course, the goal, every church has a policy. That is our goal with Heartland and Iakota Classis Safe Church team, that we do have all of our churches in those classes have a policy. It could be a matter of time before an allegation arises in your own church. If Safe Church is not a priority in your church, just know that responding in the time of crisis is very difficult. Like after the fact. Heck, I can say from experience, it is difficult no matter what. But if you have Safe Church started, that will help your process going forward a lot more. Wouldn't it be way more beneficial to be proactive and help a safe church policy before it was ever needed? According to our CDC in 2019, 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys do experience sexual abuse in childhood. Taking that one step further, the CRCNA website yearbook report that was back in 2010, of course, that said that about half of our churches had any kind of safe church policy, and it was uncertain of how effective they were. And I think Bonnie indicated that in the first Zoom meeting we had. We don't know whether those policies are well written or whether they are being followed. It is disappointing, to say the least, for our churches. In 1992, a study by Calvin College Social Research Center found that 28% of CRC members had experienced physical, sexual, or emotional abuse. 28% of CRC members does translate to thousands of people. And they also found many of them, 50%, whom had admittedly also abused someone else. Your responsibility as Safe Church team members is to champion Safe Church in your church. That may mean meeting with church councils regarding policies on a regular basis to ensure compliance. It may mean finding your resources of it. Maybe the Circle of Grace that we have already mentioned in your Sunday school. It may mean other resources that you've already heard. Maybe talking to Bonnie Nicholas or Tara Boer. Our church classes team is here to help you. Consultation assistance. We are, any of us here would love to help with whatever process you need with Safe Church Policy and team formation. Advisory panel process, that is a little further down the road. That's the process when you actually have an allegation that's been reported. That's we're more in-depth team that is at the classes level. Here's the arguments on all sides. So that one would come if needed, ever be. All right, rationale for a policy. Knowing the reasons or why we have church policy helps to motivate those who do not see a need for safe church policy. And yes, there are plenty of them in our congregations. It's to create a safe place in church, to protect the children. It is our responsibility as it is actually, I should say, the responsibility of the church council to provide a safe space that nurtures worship and faith, with a special mind to those of the most vulnerable among us, our children. Policies also protect church staff and volunteers from false allegation. Very important in our culture of litigation. Also, I have written there to create an opportunity to talk about abuse, to respond to situations of abuse, to satisfy legal counsel's requests, and to satisfy insurance companies' requirements. You may review all the policies with those legal and insurance agents. There are excellent sources of information for reducing your risk. It may or may not be a requirement of your church insurance policy. You would have to look into that. Having a policy sends a message that this is a strong place. The infinite value of each person is honored and respected. Getting started. Gain support from a leadership and obviously, hopefully getting it to be a mandate. Form a committee. Various voices are needed. And along that line, creating a policy does obviously take more than one person, especially if you are starting from the ground zero, little belief mentality. Your organization, church constituents, pastors, and council members should start to seek education and awareness of abuse among staff participants, parents, and all congregational members. You will want support from leadership and input from various people who are affected by the policy. It could be a committee that works best with, say, a parent, a nursery worker, a youth leader, someone from gyms or cadets counselors, or the other other programs. Even may be beneficial to think outside of the box and utilize resources inside your congregation in implementing that process. That can go as far as to utilize those with desired backgrounds and knowledge of their desired trade or profession to assist in that formation. Who would be those good candidates to assist? Well, we think of police officers, social workers, RNs, teachers, lawyers, insurance agents, things of that nature to help that committee get going. No one policy works well everywhere. Each church is unique. Each church has its own programs, buildings, sources, and personnel. And it also takes time. The process is helpful. Please remember that it will. It's a valuable process and it will take a while. The implementation process takes time. It cannot go too fast. It cannot go too slow. Congregations need time to grasp and understand changes. The implementation team should acknowledge the resistance and conflicts. Don't let it control the implementation process. The implementation team should be intentional, form a timeline, and be goal-oriented and stay focused. Important considerations. A policy must be maintained and followed. Keep it simple. A policy that sits there on the shelf or way in the file is not helpful. Supervision and accountability should be incorporated into the policy. So should regular review and training of staff and volunteers. Annual training of staff and volunteers is another way that Safe Church team members can help. Offering to do training of staff and volunteers each way is a way to keep Safe Church in the minds of our church leaders. General policy components. So what needs to be included in the policy? So getting to the nitty-gritty policy part, these are the basic components. Philosophy of ministry, the purpose of the policy, why do we have a policy? In addition to the approach to faith development, also includes what we've already talked about, such as a safe place for worship and growth, respecting the infinite value of each person. Definitions, what types of abuse does the policy address? Is it sexual abuse, physical neglect, emotional abuse, and now, of course, the newer one that's coming to light, abuse of power. Having all those definitions in that policy, it gives that clear guidance of what that all means. Who is included under the policy? We need to know about who needs to know about it and receive regular training. Is it just staff, councils, volunteer people? Policies are a way of providing all parties with clear expectations. Be specific to each of the children's ministries your church offers. What ministries are those? For our church, we have, of course, Vacation Bible School, Nursery, Children in Worship, Cat Church, Sunday School, Cadets, GEMS, Junior and Senior Youth Groups, church councils, and staff members. Specific policy components. Some situations represent a greater risk than other situations, and therefore they need more specific guidelines. Discipline situations are like different people have different ideas about what is appropriate for discipline. At church, each person must be respected. Discipline situations must be handled in a professional manner. Transportation policies that most conform to the laws. When you're in the cars, are you wearing seatbelts? How many kids and adults are in the car? What are the risks involved in transportation? Supervision and screening policies are the most vulnerable legally for our churches. Negligence in one of these two areas can lead to legal trouble. Due diligence needs to be done in screening for those who work with children and vulnerable populations. Regular line of authorities and responsibilities need to be established. Who is ultimately responsible for what goes on at Sunday school or at youth group? What lines of accountability are in place? how do you hold volunteers and staff accountable for situations they are in and their behaviors? Screening for volunteer and staff. Who will obtain and review the application and reference forms? Who can make recommendations? Who can approve those recommendations? And how are screening materials stored? A note about screening. Basically, criminal background checks are becoming a little bit more of the norm. There are some scams out there. It must be a reliable source for providing a criminal background check. The limitations, there are all kinds of them out there. Sex offender registry has its limitations. Only criminal sexual offenses that involve a minor, only convictions. There are limitations with time. It doesn't predict your first offense. It doesn't include underreported offenses or plea deals, limited area if it is just a screening, a state screening. More comprehensive checks can be cost prohibitive. Nationwide checks is possibly a better option when people move from place to place. Fingerprinting, even better yet, but it is very expensive. And I know on the CRCNA website, there are other options that you can go and look into if you're considering or thinking about that. No matter how thorough the background checks, it is only good for the moment. It's not a predictor of future behaviors. Also does not show unreported cases. It should not be used as alone as a screening tool. It should be part of a complete assessment, which includes obviously the application, interviews, and references. Background checks can be repeated every 2 to 5 years, or the waiver could be an option that your church goes with every 2 to 5 years that they have not committed any criminal offenses.
We do get a lot of questions about background checks, like where to get them from and who to use, because I think a lot of insurance companies are requiring churches now to ensure that their congregation lead or ministry leaders are having them. So one company that I know, Covenant CRC in Sioux Center uses, and that now Bridge of Hope is used. I don't know if you have one.
You use it. Yeah.
Screening One is one that we've used before. It's called Screening One.
Yeah, that's one I have listed. Yep.
Yep.
There's Protect My Ministries.
Okay, good. Maybe you're getting to that. That's fine.
Screening One. No, I wasn't necessarily going to go into detail.
That's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, there are churches that have gotten to the point of wanting to have background checks, but we'll get beyond a little bit more of what we do at our church in detail going forward here.
Good.
Any other questions that people have with that? Not yet.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
We have in Orange City, we have all of our GEMS groups meet at our church, and all of the cadet groups meet at a different church. And I'm wondering if there is precedence for how that gets handled when there's multiple church groups.
Correct.
Whose policy is first established, or whose obligation is that?
Good question.
So we also have something similar. We have like 2 churches together with one GEMS group. What we do, because it's set up in our church, we require our policy at our church, Bethel CRC, to be the one that covers when they're in our church. So we have all of the counselors from the opposite church sign those papers for our church, so that we have our all our ducks in a row. Does that answer? Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah. So. Just a couple other things on that. Of course, the screening is only part of the overall screening process. I already mentioned that: application, interview, and references. Also, this added part here, known person, someone who has been part of your congregation for a while. So if you've had new members joining in, you would probably have to think about, okay, we don't really necessarily know a lot about that person. Are we okay with letting that person be a Sunday school teacher or in the gyms counseling for that? So deciding with that committee what is okay. Some people pick the 6-month policy, some people pick a year. And I'll talk a little bit more on that next slide too, what we had with our church. Policy highlights. Look over your church policy. See if it includes, of course, the basic components, the philosophy, the definitions, general guidelines, discipline, transportation, supervision, and screening. And along with the screening process, reference forms, background checks, it may be that your church will start out with the screening only for those with paid positions. Something similar to pastors, youth group leaders, musical leaders, or those in the newer members to your church to volunteer with your youth programs. We here have had college students who are new to us in our church. They're maybe in the youth ministry program at the colleges, and they want more experience with kids. We've had that where they wanted to jump in and help out with youth groups. So what we have done before is doing the reference of those people, because obviously they're not part of our church for more than 6 months. So we have referenced them from their church that they belong to and had that confirmation that from their church of them feeling that they'd be okay with our kids. So in our church, we have not gotten on board yet with the background checks. There are a few moving forward, like I said earlier, with it. Tara just shared that her church is starting it this year, right? Yeah. But what we have done is we have what we call an adult volunteer. Anybody who's volunteering signs what we call an acknowledgement of individual responsibility. So every year at the start of the academic year, which initially, I must confess that was very frowned upon, that we had everybody sign it every year. It has now become kind of a way of life for our volunteers, and the acceptance level of it has increased as we've moved along. It is basically a volunteer acknowledgement and pledging of them to live by our safe church policy standards, and it includes their demographic info, membership info, options to acknowledge of any arrest or felonies, and a waiver to any misconduct that is discovered as they're leading our kids. So other ones that I have listed there: provision for training volunteers and staff. We kind of try to do that year to year at the beginning of the start of school, and using those acknowledgement of individual responsibility pages, getting that signed, reporting guidelines, and obviously we would like the system of regular review. Just adding in there, your policy is a living, working document. We know that all policies that they need to be regularly reviewed, to making sure that it is what you're doing as a group, and that if there is anything that needs to be adjusted, that should be looked into. So if there's some rules that the Sunday school realizes or recognizes, oh, this isn't really what we're doing, then we need to fix the policy so that it is what you're doing. So that regular review is something that would be helpful. What we do is we have those supervisors in those children's ministries come to our annual review, and then we talk about the whole policy and go from beginning to end to making sure that we are doing what it says. All right, languages to avoid in the policy as we're going through those reviewing. This is another thing that we're looking at. Being too vague or not specific. Language is not consistent from section to section. Avoiding the words all, never, must, or should. Avoiding unenforceable policies. Policies versus procedure. That's just important to remember, that language in there. If it is an expectation that people do it, then it is a policy. If it is helpful or desirable for people to do it, then it is a procedure. The word guideline is policy for legal purposes. The document should separate the policy section from the appendix of information and balance the practical with the reasonable. Responding to disclosures. Another part in your policy that we should include, that we would believe what they're saying. Do not try to convince the child that the story is not true or did not really happen. Do not suggest an alternative explanation, such as a dream. Children, don't make this up. Stay calm. Resist the temptation to overreact with fear, disgust, or anxiety. The child may stop talking or may believe that you think they have been bad. Do not promise to not tell anyone. Tell the child that you want to find help for everyone so that the child will be safe from hurt. Reassure the child that it was good to tell someone, and remind the child that whatever has happened was not his or her fault. No child deserves to be hurt. Do not investigate. Listen closely. Write down the information immediately after that conversation while it is still fresh in their minds. If appropriate, pray with the child. Keep the child and the family in your personal prayers and follow up later in the week and the months following. Show concern and support. This will help reduce the shame. Follow your church reporting procedures, which should state who to report to, and should have report forms to fill out and keep on file. Reporting suspected abuse. When in doubt, report to authorities. Mandated reporters. In Canada, it's everybody over 18. In the United States, it's certain professionals, and that also varies state to state. And we have right in here, clergy needs to know. Mandated reporters are held criminally liable for not reporting if they know that suspected abuse and did not report it. On the flip side, it should be noted, I'll mention here as well, that for clergy, some states specify the circumstance under which a communication is privileged or allowed to remain confidential in their profession. Basically, that means state law says what a pastor can and cannot report. What childwelfare.gov said in the privileged states where pastors can mandate to report. For the states closest in our areas, I'm just going to mention those. It's Michigan, Minnesota, and North Dakota. State laws where pastors are not considered mandatory reporters. Rather, they are mandated to keep things confidential. Pretty sad, but it is in Iowa and South Dakota. So that really can put a strain on our pastors who are not allowed to report to authorities. Reporting can be made anonymously, first person recommended, Report only what is seen and heard. And then the last part of our policies, appendixes. What information complements the policy? Of course, we have lots of forms. This is not part of the policy. It's kind of the backside of the policy. For us, it is that statement of individual responsibility form. It can also be application forms, reference forms, annual renewal forms, permission waiver forms, certificate of driver eligibility forms, accident forms, things that happens on your campus premises. Once you have your policy together and it's been reviewed by your Safe Church team, you will need to bring it to council to get the final okay and to make sure that they, obviously they're the ones that own the policy, and to seeing to it that it's carried out. It is also recommended that you post your policy on your church website. So Safe Church teams enforce the policy and the day-to-day operations, but the council is the one that's seeing to it that it's carried out. So other things in that appendix, local and denominational resources with phone numbers, crisis hotlines, and counselors. Policies when an outside organization uses the facility, types of abuse and signs and symptoms that go with each one, and how to respond to a report of an abuse. Resources, those are ones that we can, you guys can click into. The dove nest one on the bottom there, it's one that I really like as well. Tara and I, we really kind of like the option of on that website. It gives you a nice checklist to going through and making sure. It's the title of it is Child and Youth Protection Policy Checklist for churches. So if you ever get a chance to go into that, even going to dovenest.net itself is very helpful along with the CRCNA Safe Church website. Those are ones that I have saved in my safe or in my saved emails or websites that I can go to all the time quick. So I think that's all. One other thing, just our Safe Church teams are also good resources to each other as well. So don't ever hesitate to contact us if ever needed. So that's all I have. If you have any questions, further comments with any of that.
Very good, Heidi. Thank you. I don't think I knew that about Iowa pastors. I knew that Iowa didn't mandate pastors to report. I just figured they were voluntary reporters at that point. But you're saying that Iowa has said that it's privileged. So then they would have to pass that mandated responsibility onto someone else maybe that could report it.
Well, if they wouldn't be able necessarily to release the
share it
information.
unless they'd have to encourage the
basically
victim to tell
a
someone
mute
else.
social worker in that world. I don't know if anybody else has any information on that. I recognize you, Scott. I don't know if you, in the leadership pastor role, have any knowledge in that regard.
The only thing that I know is actually from the military, which is we also have 100% confidentiality. And at that point, your best bet is to convince them that it's a good thing to talk about this with people and help encourage them to talk to somebody who then can report it, because your hands are tied. You can't. Right.
I know our pastor too has that exact, your hands are tied, that he has from Michigan, going from there to Iowa has been that big challenge of not being able to report, which means we all have to, there's enough going on in legislation and government as it is, but there's a lot that we could fix too.
Yeah, I definitely didn't know that. Thanks for that. I guess I just figured that pastors are voluntary reporters and not mandatory. So that's interesting.
Yeah, yeah. You see,
Do we have an advisory panel set up in our classes? I mean, we don't, do we right now? No, we'd have to talk with Bonnie about how to get that rolling, huh?
there is, I did see on CRCNA website that there is something soon coming up for like an introduction
Training.
for training
Oh.
for that.
Okay.
It's not close by, but we'd have to have a team from
Yeah.
our classes go, if that be the ones that are now set up with Heartland and Iakota. We'd have to have a team that goes to do that and learns how to do that.
How to mediate and
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So
And it
right
has
now
to be
at this
someone-
point, we don't.
It has to be someone. Does it has to be someone? I thought the advisory panel was set up with people outside of the classes, or am I wrong with that?
Well, that's
That-
right. So we would have a team set up for another class.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. You're
So
right. when you say
we
that.
would. Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah.
That's something that we could move ahead on too in our classes if something were to come up. I don't know who our advisory panel would be. I don't even know. So,
No. Well, it became the delegates. It could be potentially of the classes, the pastors in their role.
Sure.
While we're without an advisory panel process, it becomes their role.
Interesting. Anybody else have any you can stop your share screen and then we get to see all your beautiful faces a little larger. There you go.
Certainly. Thank you.
There's what other questions do you have, or Heidi, what other thoughts do you have?
I have a quick question, if you don't mind.
Yeah,
Most
we
of
have
the
till
resource-
10:40.
Okay, most of the resources that you listed were for children. Wondering if those resources are also good for say adults with special needs, or we know abuse doesn't necessarily just happen to children and youth.
Mhm.
Are the resources you provided? I jotted a bunch of them down. Are there also resources on those websites and through those organizations for other groups, other demographics that might be impacted by abuse?
Yes. And special needs is kind of included right along with children. It's the same area. There is lots of samples of Safe Church policies on all of those as well. And I'll tell you, to be honest, but in 2012, when we sat down and started this policy formation, we just took one right from the website, and we went with it and then tried to fit it into our church and what we do. So if you need to do that, use that resource.
That's likely what we'll be doing too.
Yes.
So
Yep.
we've got a couple samples and
Yep.
Yeah.
That's really the best way to start. It's the easiest way to start.
I think so too. But I do think that a lot of the language, is children dependent adults. And so I think you have to be clear about who you're intentionally trying to protect, because we know that, like I said earlier, there's domestic violence situations, and that takes away the mandatory reporting part of our obligation. But I think there's room for a discussion about how as ministry leaders that we address allegations, because obviously you're not a mandatory reporter, but I think there's that abuse of power can kind of play into silencing victims or minimizing, their experience and allowing the abuse to continue. So I don't know if I've seen a lot of language. I know it's not in ours, because I think Safe Church in our ministry is really just owned right now, at least children, dependent adults. Some people ask about what about shooters and intrusion and things like that. And I'm like, we can't do that too. You need to find another committee. Like you find an environmental safety committee or find your cops and, get something going. Cause I do think that that's an important topic, but I don't know if you want to take that on, because it's just a whole nother world of safety and education. But I do think probably our Safe Church responsive policies could name what we're going to do when adult victims come forward and say, that another congregation member, like within their family, has hurt them. Just that like I said, I've heard ministry leaders tell them to go home and just let it continue. And I don't think that's an appropriate response either. So I don't know. I mean, I'm still thinking through what that looks like, but I think there's room for that in our policies that maybe isn't quite as articulated, at least not in ours. I don't know if it is in yours, Heidi, but yeah.
It is kind of a confusing traveling road, even in our congregation. We do have that safe environment, safe shooting.
Oh yeah. Yeah. You do have that in your policy.
We don't have it in the policy, but we are officially finally in a bigger committee, per se, of people that we as Safe Church joined in with them. So we're kind of together.
Right. That's good.
And
That's
it
good.
really
So
actually kind of gave us a bigger committee to some degree, because really otherwise we were just two people.
Yeah, I was going to ask
doing
you
all the
about
Safe Church, and that is very hard. Please, if anybody wants to hear anything else, get 3 or more. It's a lot of work if you're trying to get all those applications, and if you're requiring all that, if you want the applications, and if you want the references, and it's a lot of work to do just for 2 of you, and then working on your own with your own jobs and family. That is another huge recommendation I would make.
Good. I was wrong. This is supposed to be over at 10:35. So give you 5 minutes to use the restroom and get more coffee. But but Heidi, you did great. I learned a lot of things from you too. I could tell you just worked really hard to prepare, and thank you for working hard and helping us do well. I'm excited that we recorded it, because now if anybody comes to me and be like, we don't know how to do policy, I'm just going to send them this and then say, I'll try to help after you watch this, and then see what we need to do. So thank you very much, Heidi.